and welcome to Random Act of Squirrel. Today is Act 25, Tales of Common BadAssery, Noticing the Awesome Next Door. So this is a new group I'm making, thus the title, which you can see here, Tales of Common BadAssery. It's something that it's kind of a favorite thing or a favorite thought in my mind, so follow along, you'll see what I mean here. A lot of times, kind of like the girl next door, there's people that you kind of peel a little past social circle and you realize, holy cow, this person is amazing. Like, on a personal level, this isn't world-changing, I suppose, but one of the things that's kind of interesting is when I went to Master Splinter's father's funeral, or mother's funeral, my grandmother, one of the things that really surprised me, because maybe you're not old enough, you don't think about it, your grandma, that kind of thing. She was like in her mid-80s, and she was still working because she wanted to work. And what kind of amazed me is the funeral didn't look, or when I went to the funeral, it didn't look like what I thought the funeral would look like. I was thinking more blue-haired ladies or, that kind of older people, stuff like that. It was interesting because I discovered there's all these little layers of things that I didn't know about her. Like, I guess she was actually a pretty active member in her church, which I didn't know. And then the other part that was interesting to see all these coworkers who made sure they took the time off to be at her funeral or at the wake because they wanted to go see someone that they referred to as endearingly as I called Grandma. And so it was kind of cool, and you notice there's like things that you just kind of assume because you see it, you gloss over and assume, well, they're just that person. Like maybe you look over next door and you see some old retired person, you don't realize that maybe they were, what's for sure, maybe they were like a NASA engineer or something like that. And as you talk to them, you discover like all these layers of awesome, all these layers of badass that you never knew existed that close or that you just weren't aware of. Every once in a while when like her like digital girl's dad will talk, we'll just discover like a different little layer about him. I find it really fascinating. Or like you'll see someone who's maybe just of your generational shift and you realize, wow, this guy had like, I think, this is old for some people, but there was a run in like 4 years and they set the record where Kenny Loggins had #1 hits from soundtracks every year. It was off I'm Alright, off of Caddyshack, and then there's Top Gun in there, where he had a couple of that, and Footloose, and there might have been another one. There were like 3 or 4 years, he was like the king of the soundtracks. And then life moves on, and the statistics and the records broken get evolved, and you forget about it, but at that moment, you're like, wow, that guy was really badass. And I think that's what I want to point out, because I think everyone wants to be Tom Brady, or I don't know, Steve Young, or Steve Young's closer to more of a sneaky badass, the kind of more like the box here where you can say common badassery. Joe Montana, they want to be LeBron James. And the reality is, you're probably not going to be that if you get your highest. You're just not. Because there's only a few of those people in the world. Most people dream of being Tiger Woods and being universally known. The reality is that you're more likely going to be Phil Mickelson, which means he'll go down as a legend later because he's really good, and he'll be his own version of badass. But he's never going to be at that level. So I like to temper my heroes, I guess, because those are the ones I can reach to. Those are the ones that took whatever's going on. Maybe they weren't the most handsome. Maybe they didn't always have the right opportunities, and they made things out of themselves. I just find that fascinating, I guess. And then I tend to read a lot of biographies. I noticed as I was thinking about this, a lot of them end up being baseball, which that's my sport if I have to pick one, but I think the ideas are universal. One of the guys I find interesting who in baseball was massively, massively appreciated, and yeah, he also has a really fun name. His name is Buck Schowalter. And if you've never heard of him, you've probably seen a lot of his results. I think he started coaching, he might have had a job before this, but so he's with the Yankees in the 90s, and they've been a whole bunch of bad in the 80s, couldn't really get themselves together, helped build a foundation, Gets through the baseball strike in like '94, and then gets to the point that actually brings them to the playoffs. And then he gets fired. And then Joe Torre gets hired, and he has this well-built machine that Buck Schowalter made, and he runs it into the championship stuff that it was in the late '90s, early 2000s. And then he gets hired by the Arizona Diamondbacks. He starts building a foundation there, and starts getting the core players. He did a couple of lucrative trades. They got Kurt Schilling. They got Randy Johnson. Both these people are, depending on how you view Kurt Schilling, are Hall of Fame level people. But he built a foundation for this team, and then it goes on and gets into World Series itself. But he was gone again, and other people got the credit. I think he also went to Cleveland, and he built another team, and that made a playoff run in the 2000s. But he always just never seemed to get that last little bit. I think he was also on some, for those that are a little more modern, I think he has fingerprints on the new Baltimore Orioles team, which got in the playoffs for like the first time in 25, 30 years. It's been a long time for the Orioles. And I think it's the first time in a long time for Peter Angelos, who's considered many considered to be one of the worst owners in the game. But he has this touch. He knows how to build things. The one I really want to talk about, and this is going to sound a little bit like a cheat until I dig in deeper. Another thing about the sort of concept that I have with, again, Common BadAssery, is you'll get someone who looks like a one-hit wonder, and then you just start peeling and go, wow, I know that, and they did that, and they did that, and they did that. It's kind of like when you listen to some of these artists that have 3 songs in the 80s, when you listen to I Love the 80s or 80s on 8 on Sirius XM, and then you open up their greatest hits album, and you realize they can run like 25 deep, and you know most of them. Maybe like Journey would be a good example, where if you say Journey, no one really thinks about it, although they're big kings, so that's a bad example, I suppose, but I'll run with it. There's like a handful of songs everyone knows because they play all the time, but then you open up their catalog and realize, I know this one, 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 and suddenly you're marking off like 15 songs that you've heard. And this is the Common BadAssery of what I'm talking about. You become so cornerstone to culture that people don't even realize that you did what you did. So the one that I like, or my favorite one I'm going to bring up now, mostly because I've kind of read about him, but I can just go off information. I don't have to attach it to anything else, and I can have a nice clean description without hooking it into any other boxes or categories, is Brach Rickey. Brach Rickey, to most people, is known as the guy who signed Jackie Robinson. And trust me, in the world of baseball, that's a big thing right there, because he's probably one of the 2 or 3 most important people in baseball, probably one of the 2 or 3 most important sports people in the 1900s. Let's be completely honest. I think that's the truth. But Brach Rickey, he basically changed everything he did since he started. He was a bad baseball player, and then he went to college to learn how to do business and management, and then he had a door open up for a really bad team that's called the St. Louis Browns. And the St. Louis Browns, I think, became the Baltimore Orioles. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think they became the Baltimore Orioles in the 50s. There was 2 teams in St. Louis, the Cardinals, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the Browns, which were always a bad team. I don't think they ever really had a playoff run until Baltimore got a hold of them. And so they were just an also-ran for years and years and years. But he got his sea legs there. He started off as a manager, started climbing up, and he started becoming a GM, actually, which that concept had never existed before, someone who run the talent, all that kind of stuff. In 1916, and this is something I'm actually curious about, there was this thing called the Federal League that existed. I think that's what it's termed. And they wanted to make a league to compete against the National League and the American League. And it lasted like a year. It's a controversy. And honestly, I would like to see a documentary about it because I could probably pick it up faster. But that sounds fascinating to me. It's a bunch of teams that were mirror teams and others that were either in the American or National League. They tried to get started and they got stomped almost immediately. St. Louis Browns got in cahoots with some of them. They tried getting him out of the game for some reason because he had connections. He got moved over to the St. Louis Cardinals. And that's when Brach Rickey really becomes Brach Rickey. So for those that think it's a big rambling baseball thing, it is, but I promise to tie it up because there's something huge here. What I want you to catch, if you're not a baseball person, is hear the innovations. Because if you know anything about baseball, much of this is commonplace. And this is the guy who's responsible for most of the decisions, or at least doing it in a form that we could build on. He created the bread that all these sandwiches could be made. So he became the first GM. This didn't exist before. And it was because they realized that he wasn't a really good coach, which they discovered. And then somewhere in the process, World War I happened. But he wasn't really a good manager. He got fired as a manager, but he kept on because people noticed his eye for talent and how he understood how things worked for players and how to run a team. And since at that time in like the 20s and early 30s, most everything west of the Mississippi didn't exist as social culture. They were the westernmost team, and they couldn't get talent. So they would go try to sign somebody. The Yankees would try to sign somebody, and the Yankees would always get the best talent. So they created this thing called the farm system, minor leagues. They would go through and create partnerships with lesser league teams and develop their talent because they realized the only way they were going to get their good talent was to help build it themselves. Now every single system has a farm system or minor leagues. He did that for a number of years, and as he built it, especially as GM, because that's where he thrived, because he was an okay manager, but honestly, he was better as the GM. He brought him to 6 World Series, and he won 4. And that was from 1917 to 1942. In 1942, he had an offer of 25% share with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he could be GM there. So he took the money, he joined the Dodgers, and he did things like create spring training, which is now commonplace. He created batting cages so people could learn how to hit. Because he was doing northern cities, he thought the idea of letting these people sharpen up before they get up and play. He is responsible for creating the bones that created spring training. And after a couple years of fumbling around and finding talent, building up farm systems, using everything he used before, he then signed this guy named Jackie Robinson. Perhaps you heard of him. And he went to 2 World Series. He didn't win any of them there, but for his career, for those that are counting, that means that is 8 World Series teams that he's responsible for. And then at the end of 1950, he noticed there was some muscling going around, and somewhere around there, I have to re-wiki this, but I want to keep running with it. The Dodgers went from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, and one of the main owners died. They were squabbling with who owned what, and so he sold his share to somebody else that wasn't the guy who wanted it, just to get even, and made a pretty penny. And then he went to coach the Pittsburgh Pirates. What he did on the Pirates was another innovation. He realized there was a huge pool of players south of the United States in the Caribbean islands that all played baseball. So he went to the Dominican Republic, he went to Puerto Rico, and he started signing these players on dirt fields with crappy balls and brought them up in there. One of the people he signed was a guy named Roberto Clemente. And not only is he known for hitting exactly 3,000 hits and dying on a plane, he also helped the team to a couple World Series. At that point, he became a title that no one had heard before, which is the Executive VP. He had some health stuff that kicked in, so he wasn't there to see the victory stuff, but he built a foundation that the Pirates ran on in the 60s, and then also with a lot of steam where Pirates ran on as a winning team again. They had been in earlier, but had fallen in some really hard times, which led you into the 70s teams that were really good. But he built that culture. Then he went back to St. Louis, did that for a handful of years, and rebuilt that team so it could start winning some stuff in the early 60s and won some World Series there too. And then in about 66, between that, he created another thing that's kind of wild. And so if you live in Kansas City or like Dallas or Minneapolis, you can thank him for having a team because he went through and realized there was no teams in the middle of the United States. So he was creating a league with mirror teams in certain cities because he realized like New York only had one team now. So he created something that eventually they ended up buying out and creating the New York Mets. They brought the Washington Senators into Minneapolis, so being Minnesota, that he's indirectly responsible for that. There's only like 3 teams of a 16-league team that he was making, which is called the Continental League, that didn't get teams. So basically planted seeds in the middle of the U.S. and created what we know of for baseball, at least up until I'd say last 10, 15 years, or maybe 20 years now to think about it, where they started bouncing around and getting some of the other teams like the Floridas and that kind of stuff. Now, I think Brach Rickey is cool. And part of it, too, is underneath all the accomplishments I just mentioned, and why I called him, again, so I can learn Common BadAssery, is he was a very good man. So unlike Napoleon, which is coming out, who has this great list of stuff, but you get iffy about his background, here's a dude that you can actually follow. He went to Wesleyan College. I forget which kind of Christian that makes you. He was a very good, devout person. His nickname was the Mahatma, which is guru in Indian. And that's the thing that's cool. Is so not only did he compete on the field, but he also competed as a human, and he legitimately made the world a better place. So unlike going away still a little bit earlier, unlike Napoleon, who just broke stuff, and then the world had to kind of clean up after the pieces and deal with the consequences, he did generally make the world a better place after he left. He had a really bad heart thing, or he ended up dying relatively early, so he did not get elected into the Hall of Fame by way of like voting and stuff, but the Veterans Commission did put him in the Hall of Fame. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to bring up is he's the guy that gets lost because he's not flashy and amazing and super cool. And it's cooler to talk about Jackie Robinson than all the moving pieces that got Jackie Robinson to be there. But all those were essential. They're all important, and they're really vital to the whole story. And I think that's what I want to bring up. I have a whole mental list of people that I wanted to include in this, but they're bridged in books I've read or DVDs/documentaries I've watched. And I think I want to get into those because that's kind of where my heart's going right now, because I need inspiration, so I like tapping into those stories. So that finishes that thought. I hope you like that where this whole box is going. I hope it's going to be fun for everyone as it is for me. So back to the usual. If you like what you saw, go ahead and hit the like button. If you have any comments on people that you would put in this category of Common BadAssery, go ahead and put them in the comments on the comments line for me. Otherwise, if you haven't subscribed and sitting at 9, it'd be awesome to get to double digits. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and then I can make you feel like you're Common BadAssery also. Thank you. Have a very good day.